The fire in the great hall of Ironfen Hold had not gone cold in 3 years. I noticed it the way a man notices the sun, not every morning, not with deliberate thought, but with a quiet, bodily certainty that the world would be darker without it. Marina kept the fire. She kept the kindling dry and stacked in the stone alcove beside the eastern arch. She kept the iron grate clear of ash before the pack gathered for the morning meal. She kept the hearth burning through the long northern winters when the wind found every crack in the old stonework, and the younger wolves slept in their cloaks rather than their beds. She had come to Ironfen 3 years ago, in the early days after Liara's death, when the hold had gone cold in a way that no hearth fire could fix. My beta Corin had arranged her appointment quietly, a keeper from the southern settlements, skilled with remedies and provisions and the daily running of a great house. He had told me her name in passing. I had nodded and returned to the war table, because in those months I was not fit company for anyone, and the last thing I thought I needed was another pair of eyes watching me to see how a grieving king behaved. Marina did not watch me. That was the first thing I learned about her. She moved through the hold the way the small stream at Ironfen's northern edge moved through the valley, quietly, purposefully, with no particular desire to announce itself. She ordered the stores and managed the kitchen wolves. She tended the 3 elderly wolves who could no longer carry packs without pain in their joints, bringing their meals to the low wing herself rather than making them walk the long corridor to the hall. She learned within a week which of the younger pack members had been skipping their night watches and spoke to them. Not to me, not to Corin, but directly to them, privately, in a tone that apparently carried enough gentle certainty that they did not skip watches again. I knew all of this because Corin told me. I knew almost nothing of her by my own observation in those first months. I was not present for much of the hold's daily life. I sat at the war table. I rode the border lines. I met with the pack council and the tributary pack leaders and the 2 northern lordlings who were forever arguing about the river road. I did not linger in the hall. I did not take my meals with the pack in the warm, easy way a keeper alpha should, the way my father had, the way I had once done myself, before Liara fell ill in the deep of the second winter and did not rise again. It was the pack's elder, Bren, who first said Marina's name to me in a context that made me stop and listen. I had come down from the watchtower on a night when the snow had been falling for 6 days unbroken, and the north road was closed, and 3 of the border wolves had not returned from a scouting run. I was tired and cold and carrying the flat, walled-in anger of a man who has learned not to express what he actually feels. I came into the great hall and found it warm, genuinely warm, with the big hearth blazing and 3 additional braziers burning along the walls, and a long table set not with the formal pack arrangement but with the rougher, closer seating of wolves who had gathered together against a storm. There was food. There was mulled wine. There were the young wolves who spent most of their off-duty hours quarreling with each other sitting in easy proximity, and the 2 older council wolves who never agreed on anything eating from the same pot without apparent argument. And Bren was there at the far end with his deeply lined face and his white-threaded hair, and he caught my eye and nodded toward the kitchen arch, where Marina was passing out the last of the bread. She had them all here within 2 hours of the gate closing, he said when I came to stand beside him. Told them a long watch in a warm hall was easier than a long watch in a cold room, and that wolves who eat together sleep lighter and wake faster. He paused. She was right. I looked at her then properly, for perhaps the first time. She was not small, but she moved as if she were making herself smaller, weaving between the gathered pack with the bread and the warm cloths and the easy word to each wolf she passed. She wore a plain dark dress, and her hair was caught up in the simple way of working women, not the elaborate braids of the pack ceremony. She was not trying to be seen. She had simply decided that the hold needed warmth and had produced it. She glanced up and found my eyes for one moment across the width of the hall. Then she lowered her gaze and moved on, because she was Marina, and she did not watch the king. That was the second thing I noticed. She met my eyes without fear or hunger, without the careful performance of deference that some of the pack adopted in my presence, and without the bold calculation I sometimes saw in the eyes of visiting emissaries who wanted something. She saw me, acknowledged that she had seen me, and returned to her work. Not dismissal, not display. Simply herself with her task. I did not understand that night why the moment caught in my chest and would not quite let go. I told myself it was tiredness. I told myself it was the warmth of the hall after 6 days of cold. I took a cup of mulled wine from the table, stood by the fire for a long while, and then went to bed. The 3 missing border wolves came back the next morning, having sheltered in a stone outbuilding 2 miles north of the gate. Marina had sent a warming pack with one of the younger runners at first light, bread, dried meat, a small clay jar of the pressed leaf remedy she used for cold stiffened joints. She had not asked me. She had simply known they might need it, and provided it. Does she always do this without being asked? I said to Corin, who was standing at my shoulder in the yard watching the border wolves come in. Corin looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Yes, he said, always. Something shifted in my chest that I did not name. I began, without making any decision to do so, to notice her. Not in any way that I would have admitted to Corin, or to Bren, or to anyone. I was not a man who admitted things easily in those years. Grief had made me careful, and I had kept that carefulness long after the grief had softened into something less sharp, because it was by then the shape I had learned to occupy and I did not know how to set it down. But I noticed. The way she moved through the morning duties with a certain unhurried steadiness that the pack, I began to realize, organized itself around without meaning to. The younger wolves checking the time of day, by whether Marina had already cleared the hall and begun the store count. The kitchen staff working to a rhythm she set without raising her voice. The way she handled the hold's animals. Ironfin kept 17 wolves, our bonded pack wolves, not the great spirit wolves of the bond, but the physical animals who lived in the east yard and ran the border with the pack scouts. None of them had taken well to the hold's previous keeper, a competent and entirely indifferent man named Galden who had managed them with professional distance. Within 2 weeks of Marina's arrival, the eldest of the yard wolves, an old gray female called Ash who had been growing increasingly short-tempered with the younger animals, had taken to sleeping outside the kitchen door. Ash was 17 years old and had bitten 3 people in the last winter. She did not bite Marina. She talks to them, Corin told me once, with an expression hovering between amusement and something else. Not commands, conversations. I was not amused. I was something else, though I did not examine it. The way she looked after the hold's elderly, without ever making her care into a performance. Old Bren's hands had been stiffening for 2 winters, the joints swollen and painful in the cold months, and he had been quietly reducing the things he did because of it. The things he would not admit hurt him. Marina had, within her first month, rearranged the council room in a way that placed the warmest chair beside the warmest wall, directly in the path of the south-facing window's afternoon light. Bren sat in it every day. He never said thank you because he never acknowledged that it had been done deliberately. Marina never pointed it out. The chair was simply there. These were small things. They were entirely unremarkable things, the ordinary kindnesses of a good keeper doing her work well. I told myself that was all they were. But the winter deepened and the hold was warm, and the pack that had been quiet and stiff and walking carefully around its own grief for 2 years began to be, not healed, nothing so clean as that, but easier, louder at the meal table, quicker to laugh. The young wolves had started a weekly game in the east yard on the afternoons. Marina released the kitchen staff early, and the sound of it, that rough, easy, unself-conscious sound of a group of people who are not performing their well-being but simply experiencing it, reached my chamber window on those afternoons, and I found myself pausing at the glass more often than was strictly necessary. Once in the late winter of her first year, I came through the kitchen corridor before dawn because I could not sleep and I wanted water, and I found her already there in the gray pre-light, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of something warm and a piece of the previous day's bread, writing in a small notebook. The wolves, all three of the kitchen wolves who slept in the warm passage nearby, had arranged themselves around her feet in a loose semicircle. Ash was there too, pressed against her knee. Marina looked up when she heard me. The light was gray and soft, and there were a few strands of her dark hair loose around her face. She did not stand up. She did not perform the keeper's formal acknowledgement. She said, quietly and without alarm, "There is still water in the pot. It is warm if you wanted something other than cold." I poured myself a cup. I sat, not at the far end of the table, but near enough to speak easily, something I could not have explained if pressed. The wolves did not move. "What do you write?" I asked. I do not know why I asked it. "What needs doing," she said. "What has been done. What I noticed the day before that I did not act on and should have." She paused. "It is how I remember things." "What did you not act on yesterday?" She looked down at the page. "The old stone trough in the east yard has a crack that will widen in the next hard frost. It should be patched before the temperature drops again." I looked at her. She was serious. She had woken before dawn and sat in the kitchen making notes about a cracked trough, so that she would not forget to address it. "I will send one of the stone workers today," I said. "Thank you," she said, without surprise, without gratitude that bordered on flattery, without any of the inflection people use when they want you to notice how grateful they are. Simply "thank you," as if we had agreed on a sensible course of action together, which we had. I sat there longer than I had intended. The wolves slept. The light came up slowly through the kitchen window. Marina finished her bread and her notes and stood and began the work of the morning, and I sat with my warm water and watched the light change. And it was only when Corin appeared in the kitchen doorway 40 minutes later, stopped, and took in the scene with an expression of careful blankness, that I realized I had been there an unreasonably long time. I stood, I left. I spent a considerable portion of that morning not thinking about her. She had been in Ironfen for 1 year and 4 months. The second winter was the winter of the Grafen dispute, when the tributary pack to the west sent riders with a formal grievance about the river road, and the thing became a weeks-long negotiation that required my presence at the council table from early morning until the evening bells on most days. I was bad company. I knew I was bad company. I said as much to Corin, who told me with diplomatic patience that the council was managing, and that the hold was running without difficulty. "Marina has everything in hand," he said. I should not have felt what I felt when he said that. It was not a large feeling. It was quiet, and it sat low in my chest, and it was very much like the feeling of knowing that the fire in the great hall had not gone out, a warmth that had become something you relied on without fully examining how much you were relying on it. I did not examine it. I told myself that a well-run hold was simply the expected dividend of a competent keeper, and I returned to the river road dispute. But that winter, I began to notice other things. The way the pack moved around her, not with deference, not with the particular careful orbit that wolves applied to their alpha and their senior officers, but with a relaxed familiarity that spoke of trust built on small daily acts over many months. The young wolves who had given her trouble in the first weeks now stopped to speak with her in the corridor with the easy manner of those who have been fairly dealt with. The council wolves, who had been managing the hold's non-military affairs with a mixture of competence and suppressed exhaustion since Liara died, had quietly redistributed much of that work, and Marina had taken it without complaint and without seeking credit. I noticed something else that winter, which was the way the pack came to her with things they would not have brought to me. Not military things, not pack law, not grievances, not the formal business of the hold, but a younger wolf named Perrin who had been struggling quietly with the particular difficulty of his first winter far from the pack he had been born into. She knew somehow, without his telling her, and she had set him to work on a project that required his particular skills and kept him occupied and gave him the daily proof of his own usefulness that the distance from home had stripped. A kitchen wolf named Dissa who had been running a quiet, informal money-lending arrangement among the junior staff. Marina had sat with her privately, and the arrangement had been concluded and repaid, and there had been no formal report to me or the council, which told me Marina had judged that a young woman in her first position of responsibility had made a mistake that was better corrected quietly than made into a lesson at someone's expense. The 3 elderly wolves in the low wing had received, that winter, a small brazier each. The hold stores could absorb the cost. Marina had made a note in her account to that effect, and she had not asked permission because she had judged it did not require permission, which was correct. I knew all of this because I had begun, that winter, to read her keeper's account more carefully than I strictly needed to. The account was a formal record, submitted to Corin quarterly, of the hold's provisions and expenditures and the significant domestic events of the period. It was not, technically, required reading for the Alpha. I had senior staff for that. I read it anyway. Marina wrote it the way she wrote everything, precisely, without flourish, with the occasional dry understated note that said more in 4 words than most people managed in a paragraph. The note about Perrin read, assigned Northern Border Survey mapping to W. Perrin, skilled eye, good use of close weeks. The note about Dissa read, informal loan arrangement resolved per attached, no further action recommended. The note about the braziers read, 3 additional braziers placed, low wing, winter efficiency measure, cost noted. Winter efficiency measure. I read those 3 words and sat with them for some time, and thought about 3 elderly wolves sitting in the warmth on the cold nights of a northern winter, and thought about the woman who had looked at them and seen what they needed and found the least complicated way to provide it, and written it down as a winter efficiency measure, so that it was useful rather than sentimental. She was not sentimental. That was the thing I kept coming back to, in the way you return to a thought that is doing work you are not quite ready to acknowledge. She was warm, but she was not sentimental. She did not make her kindness into theater. She did not, as some people with genuine good hearts did, perform her goodness in a way that required its recipients to perform gratitude. She simply looked at a situation and saw what was needed and addressed it, and then moved on to the next thing. The kindness was structural, not ornamental. It was built into the fabric of how she moved through the hold, inseparable from the practical work of keeping the place running. That, I thought, that was what made it impossible to dismiss. An ornamental kindness I could have admired and set aside. This was not ornamental. This was the kind of goodness that had come from long habit and deep character, the kind that did not need anyone to see it to continue being itself. I put down the account. I went to the council table and spent the rest of the afternoon on the Grafin River Road dispute, and I did a poor job of concentrating. Old Bren, watching me watch her from across the hall at the winter feast, said quietly, "She is good for this place." "She is a good keeper," I said. Bren was silent for a moment, then he said, "Yes, she is that too." I looked at him sharply. He met my eyes with an expression of pure, patient innocence that I recognized as something entirely else, and then he turned to speak to the wolf on his other side, and I was left standing with a cup of wine I no longer wanted and a feeling behind my ribs that I could not quite dismiss. That night I went to the east yard in the cold and stood with the wolves for a long time, and the old gray female ash came and stood against my leg, which she had never done before. And I thought, against my will, with considerable internal resistance, that Marina had been at Ironfin for nearly 2 years, and that I did not know what the hold would do without her. And then I thought something I was not prepared for, which was that I did not know what I would do without her, which was a different thing entirely, and not one I was ready to face. I went back inside. I did not speak to Marina for 3 days, which she did not appear to notice because she was Marina, and she did not watch the king. But the 3rd year had its own quiet marking of time. There was the evening in the late spring when I came back from a 3-day border ride, tired and saddle sore, and the hold felt different the moment I rode through the gate, fuller, somehow, the way a room is different when someone you know is in it. The kitchen fire was bright. There was food already prepared because Marina had heard the gate, or the yard wolves had told her in the way bonded animals tell their people things, and she had sent the kitchen staff ahead. I did not see her in the yard. I saw the results of her foresight, the warm meal and the lit brazier in my chamber and the note on my door in her small clear hand. The north wing lintel is shored up, and the trough drainage is fixed, she had written, and then, welcome back, as if it were an afterthought, or had been added after the practical items and she had decided it was worth including. I stood in the corridor with that small piece of paper for longer than was reasonable. There was the morning in high summer when I found her in the archive corridor, the long, low passage behind the great hall where the hold's old records were kept in their stone alcoves, standing on a wooden step-stool reaching for one of the upper shelves. I was passing through on my way to the stable yard. She did not hear me coming. She was stretching for a volume that was just at the limit of her reach, her expression concentrated, completely absorbed. She got it, pulled it down with a small sound of satisfaction, and turned to step down from the stool and found me there. "I did not hear you," she said, not startled exactly. Composed in that particular Marina way of being composed, which was not a performance but a quality. "I was not making much noise," I said. "The quarterly supply record." She showed me the volume. 30 years back. I want to see what they used for winter insulation in the North Passage before the renovation. The new wool batting is not holding as well as it should. Of course she wanted to see what they used 30 years ago. Of course she was spending a summer morning in the archive corridor looking at supply records from 3 decades past so that the North Passage would be warmer by winter. I thought about this. I thought about Torvin, who had looked at her across the great hall and seen a diplomatic asset. I thought about what he had not seen, which was everything. The renovation was Aldrich's tenure, I said. Aldrich had been the keeper before Galden. He used a double layer of river rush in the lower fills before the wool. There are notes in the renovation account, if the supply record doesn't have it. She looked at me with a slight adjustment of expression. "You know the renovation accounts." "My father spent a winter in the North Passage, complaining about the cold." "I remember the year the renovation was done." I paused. "If I recall, Aldrich's notes are in the 3rd alcove, under the surveyor's records." She went to the 3rd alcove and found them, and I watched her run her finger down the columns in the low archive light, and after a moment she said, "River rush beneath, double wool batting above. Yes, that is better than the current arrangement." She closed the book and looked at me again. "Thank you." "You are welcome," I said. We stood in the archive corridor for a moment with the old stone smell of it and the cool summer light coming from the narrow windows, and it was entirely unremarkable. A keeper consulting records, an alpha who happened to know where a relevant document was filed. It was small and ordinary, and I carried it with me for the rest of the day. In a way, it had no particular right to be carried. There was the evening in the early autumn when Corin came to my chamber with the 3rd quarter account and said, without preamble, "She has a suitor." I looked up from the maps. "Not within the hold," Corin said with careful neutrality. "A merchant from the eastern valleys who has been supplying the hold's autumn grain for 2 years. He sent a formal expression of interest through the Grafen Compact." A pause. "It is a proper approach. She is entitled to consider it." I said, "What did she say?" "I have not told her yet." I thought. Corin was looking at me with the expression of a man who has been choosing his words for 3 years. I wanted to know if there was any reason I should frame it in a particular way. I held Corin's gaze for a long moment. He waited with the absolute patience of a beta who has been waiting for his alpha to come to a decision for an amount of time he considers excessive. "Tell her," I said. "Tell her it is her choice entirely." Corin nodded. He moved to leave, then he stopped. "For what it is worth," he said, she returned the merchant's expression of interest through the compact without consideration within the same week it arrived. He paused. "I thought you might want to know." He went out. I sat at the map table for some time without looking at the maps. The feeling behind my ribs had stopped being quiet. It was pressing now, with a warmth and an urgency it had not had before, and I thought about Marina in the kitchen before dawn with her notebook and her mug, and Marina in the archive corridor with her old supply records, and Marina's note on my door, "Welcome back," written as an afterthought, included anyway, and I thought, how much longer are you going to stand outside of this? Not much longer, as it turned out. But I watched her. That was the truth I was by then no longer able to fully deny to myself, that I had been watching her for nearly 2 years, without intention, without plan, with nothing but the mute, accumulating certainty of a man who has been shown something necessary and cannot look away. The way she was patient with the wolves who needed time. The way she was direct with the wolves who were wasting it. The way she laughed in the kitchen on the mornings when the bread went wrong. A low and genuine sound with no audience and no performance in it. The way she argued, quietly and without yielding, with the supply merchant who came in the second month of autumn each year and always tried to short measure the winter grain. She kept a small scale in her notebook, and she used it, and the merchant had not short measured since. The way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window in the late afternoon and watched the yard wolves playing, and her face, usually composed and directed toward some task, went briefly, privately, soft. I noticed all of it. I noticed it, and I told myself it was simply the awareness of a good keeper's work. And it was also not only that, and I was not willing in those years to stand inside what it was not only that. I had been willing once. I had been that man, the man who could stand inside love and not need to protect himself from it. Liara had made me that man, and her death had unmade it, not cruelly but quietly, the way cold unmaking things, not a blow, but a long, slow certainty that the warmth was gone and the ground was different under you now. I was not sure I was still capable of being that man. Marina, who did not know any of this, continued to keep the fire. In the 3rd year of her time at Ironfin, the year everything changed, she had been at the hold long enough that the pack had stopped thinking of her as the keeper and had begun, in the easy way of wolves who trust someone, to simply think of her as Marina. The distinction mattered to wolves. Keepers came and went. Marina was part of the hold the way the river was part of the valley. It was in the 3rd year that Alpha Torvin of the Coldmark pack came to Ironfin. I want to be careful about how I describe Torvin, because the easy thing would be to say he was cruel, and it would not quite be accurate. He was not cruel the way some alphas were cruel, openly, almost artistically, making a theater of their authority. Torvin was cold in the way of a man who has learned that coldness is effective and has stopped looking for anything else. He was a tributary pack leader under the Ironfin Compact, which meant he owed fealty and supply contributions and could call on Ironfin's military protection in return. He had observed the letter of the compact without warmth or complaint for 8 years. He arrived in the 2nd month of autumn with a proper formal party, 12 riders, an envoy, the tributary gifts, and stayed for 3 days of meetings about the border survey and the new road agreement. He was efficient and correct. And then on the 3rd evening, at the formal close-of-discussion meal in the great hall, he watched Marina. I saw it happen. She was moving along the far wall, overseeing the late service, speaking quietly to the kitchen wolves about the arrangement of the closing wine. She was not dressed for ceremony. She wore the plain dark of her daily work. She had not been introduced to Torvin. She was the keeper. That was not a customary introduction. She was simply present, as she always was, doing the quiet work that made the hall run. Torvin watched her for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he turned to his envoy and said something in a low voice. The envoy wrote something down. The cold feeling that moved through me then was not a thing I had felt before, and it was not ambiguous. It was not until the following morning, 1 hour before Torvin's party was due to ride out, that his envoy presented a formal supplement to the road agreement. A rider, added by hand at the bottom of the copied compact, requesting that Ironfin's current headkeeper be transferred to Coldmark as part of a permanent hospitality arrangement. The language was formal. It described Marina as a diplomatic asset whose skill in household management and pack welfare would strengthen the Coldmark-Ironfin relationship. It noted, at the bottom, that the arrangement would be to her material benefit. It did not ask her. It asked me. I stood in the council room with the document in my hand, and Corin was there, and 2 of the council wolves, and the Coldmark envoy with his careful face, and the silence in that room was absolute. I was aware of Corin's eyes on the side of my face. I was aware of the council wolves waiting with the particular stillness of wolves who can feel the temperature in a room and are trying to decide what the temperature means. I put the document on the table. No, I said. The envoy blinked. Alpha Torvin requests. Torvin may request what he chooses, I said. The answer is no. She is not a diplomatic asset. She is a member of this pack. She is not available for transfer at any Alpha's request, including mine. The last 2 words were not planned. I heard myself say them and felt the room's temperature shift again, in a different direction, and did not take them back. The envoy withdrew. He would carry the refusal to Torvin. Torvin would be displeased and would express that displeasure through his usual channels, and I would deal with it, and none of that mattered. I was aware of nothing except the weight of the thing I had just said, and what it meant, and what I was going to have to stop pretending it didn't mean. I turned to Corin. Corin said, with the carefully composed face of a man who has been waiting for approximately 3 years, "Shall I ask Marina to come to the council room?" "Not yet," I said. I walked out through the hall and through the kitchen corridor and into the east yard, where the morning was cold and pale, and the yard wolves were moving in the frost. Old Ash was at the trough that Marina had flagged in her notebook 3 winters ago, and that I had patched the following morning, that now sat solid and uncracked with moss beginning to grow in its joints. Ash looked at me with her yellow-gray eyes. I had been keeping this particular truth at a careful distance for nearly 3 years. I had been telling myself that what I felt when Marina looked up from her work and met my eyes was simply the recognition of good character in a member of my pack. That my awareness of her movements through the hold was the natural attention of an alpha to his territory. That the mornings in the kitchen were simple and what they appeared to be. A man who could not sleep, and a woman who rose early to work, sharing the practical warmth of a fire. I was not capable of maintaining those particular stories any longer. It was not only recognition of good character. It was not only an alpha's territorial awareness. It had not been only those things for a very long time, perhaps, if I was honest with myself, not since the gray morning of that first winter. The kitchen, the loose strands of her hair in the pre-dawn light, the quiet and entirely uncalculated way she had simply offered me a warm cup and spoken to me as one person speaks to another. She had never tried to reach through the wall I had built. She had never managed me or performed for me or tried to find the crack in my defenses. She had simply been herself, consistently and without audience, in every ordinary moment of 3 years. And I had, without deciding to, loved her for it for most of that time, and I had been standing here telling myself I hadn't, and I was finished with that particular dishonesty. I went back inside. "Ask Marina to come to the council room," I told Corin. Corin's careful composure broke briefly and completely into something that was simply relief. He covered it quickly. Yes, Alpha. I went to the council room. I did not sit at the table. I stood by the south window, where the morning light came in cold and clear, and I waited, and I thought about what I was going to say and how I was going to say it without making it into something she needed to perform a response to. She deserved honesty, not theater. She had given me 3 years of herself, her actual self, without theater, and she deserved at minimum the same in return. She came in after a short time, not long. She would have been nearby. She was always nearby in the mornings. And she closed the door behind her and turned to me with her composed, directed face, the one that said she was ready for whatever task she had been called for. I looked at her, and the thing behind my ribs that had been unnamed for 3 years pressed against the inside of my chest like a hand pressing a warm coal. "You know that Torvin's party left this morning," I said. "Yes," she said. "His envoy submitted a request last night, a request to transfer your position to Coldmark." She was still for a moment. Then she said without visible emotion, "I see." "I declined it." A pause. "Thank you," she said. "The same thank you as always, clean, unadorned, genuine." "Marina," I said, "I declined it before I had read it fully. I declined it before I consulted the council. I declined it before anyone had asked you your preference." I paused. "I declined it because I was not willing to consider it. And that is not an alpha's calculation. That is something else." She was looking at me now, not the directed gaze of a keeper waiting for her task, looking at me. "Something else," she repeated quietly. "I have been not aware, that's not the right word. I have been watching you for nearly 3 years," I said. It was not easy to say. It had not been easy to examine. I said it anyway because it was the truth and she had earned the truth. Not as a keeper watches a keeper. Not as an alpha watches his pack. The way I watch a person whose presence has become necessary to me, whose absence I could feel. I stopped. The words were not quite right. They were the best available words for a feeling that was much simpler and much heavier than language wanted to carry. I did not intend to. I am not sure it was a decision. It was more like noticing the fire, noticing that it was warm, and then at some point realizing I had stopped taking that warmth for granted. She was very still. "I know," I said, "that this places you in an impossible position. You are employed in this hold. What I have just said is not a command, and it is not a condition of your position. If you have no wish to, if this is unwelcome, you may tell me so, and nothing between us will change. You will keep your position. The hold will continue as it has." I paused. "I am telling you because I am done not telling you. Because I have been standing very carefully on the outside of the truth for too long, and Torvin standing in my hall and looking at you like a resource to be moved was something I was not able to be contained about." Marina looked at the window. She looked at the light coming through it, that same cold, clear morning light, the same pale gold that had been the light in the kitchen 3 years ago when I had sat at her table and not known what I was doing. She said slowly, "I have worked here for 3 years. Yes. In those 3 years I have spoken to you perhaps 40 times at length." She paused. "And every time I went back to the kitchen afterwards and thought carefully and with considerable effort about something else." I looked at her. Something moved in my chest, different from the cold warmth, sharper. "Considerable effort," I said. "Yes," she met my eyes. Hers were steady and dark and honest. "I am a keeper. You are an alpha who had not yet finished grieving when I came here, and it was not my place to. I would not do that. I would not make myself into a thing you were managing rather than a person you were. I did not want to be a solution to a problem. I wanted—" She stopped. "What did you want?" I said. I heard my own voice quieter than it had been. "I wanted," she exhaled slowly. "I wanted the fire to matter for its own reasons, not because the hall was cold." I crossed the room. I did not do it quickly. I was aware of every step, aware of giving her all the space she needed to stop me, to step back, to say the word that would have been enough and that I would have honored entirely. She did not step back. She watched me come with those honest dark eyes, and when I stopped in front of her I was close enough to see the particular set of her face, not performance, not waiting, simply present. With me. "Marina," I said, "the fire has been burning since before I was ready to know what it was. It mattered then. It matters considerably more now." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, with a quietness that held everything, "Then I think you are ready." I lifted my hand and offered it to her, open, not a claim, not a king asking for compliance, but a man asking for a choice. She looked at my hand for one breath. Then she put her hand in mine. The mate bond did not strike like lightning. I had half expected something dramatic, the mark burn, the white light surge, the physical undeniability that some bonds arrived with. What I felt instead was something like the hall at the end of a long winter's day, when the fire has been burning steadily for hours, and the cold at the door has been held off for so long that you stop noticing you are warm and simply are it. A settling. A recognition that had been building so long and so quietly that, when it finally named itself, it felt not like a revelation, but like a confirmation. Yes, of course. This. The way you feel when you finally say aloud something you have known in your bones for years. The bond was there. It had always been there, running like the stream at the hold's northern edge, steady and patient and entirely uninterested in whether I was ready to acknowledge it. I felt it the way you feel the ground beneath your feet, solid, present, utterly without drama. Marina's hand in mine was warm. She did not cry, and neither did I, but her eyes went bright for a moment with something she blinked away quickly, and I pressed her hand with a firmness that I hoped said what I could not quite manage in words yet. That I knew what this was, that I knew how long she had carried it without saying, that I was not going to make her carry it alone anymore. "I will not do this with ceremony until you are ready," I said. "You have a choice in all of it. The timing, the way, every part of it." "I know," she said, a slight tilt at the corner of her mouth. "You said as much just now." I wanted to say it again. "You may say it as many times as you like," she said, and the tilt became something more, brief and warm and entirely hers. I kept hold of her hand. We stood there in the council room for a few minutes more in the morning light, and it was not particularly remarkable in its externals. A man and a woman standing at a window with their hands joined, in a stone room in a northern hold. It did not need to be remarkable. It was the most important moment of the last 3 years, and it was quiet, and that was exactly right, because we were people who had come to each other quietly, and it would have been wrong for it to be any other way. The pack knew by evening. Not because I announced it. That came later in the formal way, with Bren presiding, and the pack assembled and Marina in a dress that was still plain but was the best plain dress she owned. Her hair loose for once because I had told her I had spent 3 years noticing it, and she had given me a look and then worn it loose. And the bond mark on her wrist, not burning but glowing. A soft, steady warmth the color of deep amber. The color of the hall's fire seen from the inside. Which was, I thought, exactly right. But the pack knew before that because the pack always knows. They felt it in the way the hold's atmosphere shifted from its usual steady warmth into something fuller. The way a room feels when the last window is finally sealed against the winter wind, and you realize that the warmth was incomplete before. The yard wolves were restless all afternoon, in the particular way of bonded animals who feel a change in their alpha's pack weight. The kitchen wolves left the door open between the kitchen and the corridor in a way they did not usually, and Marina's voice could be heard moving between both sides, the ordinary sound of her ordinary day, but carrying, I could feel it, the resonance of the bond new named, as if the walls themselves were listening. Old Bren came to find me before the evening meal. He stood in the doorway of my chamber and looked at me with his deeply lined face and his white-threaded hair, and his 60 years of knowing what an alpha looked like when something had changed in him. "About time," he said. 3 years is not such a long time," I said. "It is an extremely long time," Bren said, with peaceful conviction. "When a man is watching a fire and pretending he doesn't know why he's standing there." I did not have a defense for that. I offered him a cup from the cabinet, which he took, and we sat in my chamber in the late afternoon of a day that had started in one particular kind of life and was ending in another. And I thought about what it had taken me, and felt the weight of that without wanting to make it smaller than it was. I had been afraid. Not of Marina, not of her, she had never been frightening. I had been afraid of standing inside it again, the warmth, the necessity of another person, the particular exposure of loving something that could be lost. I had been afraid of the version of myself who did not know how to not feel it. I had spent 3 years learning to keep that version at a careful distance, and in doing so I had spent 3 years at a careful distance from the best thing in my hold, the person who had kept the fire and not watched the king and gone back to the kitchen and thought carefully about something else, and who had been, I could feel it, through the bond, the retrospective weight of it, carrying something just as large as what I had been carrying, and carrying it more gracefully, and not once making it my problem. She had given me the time I needed, not as a strategy, not to manage me. She had given me the time because she understood that a man who had not finished grieving was not yet ready to love, and she had not tried to hurry what was not ready, and she had simply kept the fire. There had been one moment. I did not speak of it to her until much later, until one evening in the second winter after the bond ceremony when the hall was quiet, and we were sitting by the hearth, and she was writing in her notebook, and I had been watching her for some time in the uncomplicated way I was by then allowed to watch her, when I had come close to saying something too soon. It had been in the late second year, a cold night just after the Grafen negotiations had concluded, and I had come to the kitchen not for water but because the hold was quiet and I did not want to be alone with my own thoughts, and Marina had been there, not in the half-dark this time but in the full evening firelight of the kitchen hearth, reading a small worn volume that she closed when she heard me and set on the table. I had sat down without asking. She had not said anything about that. We had talked for perhaps an hour about nothing consequential, the Grafen negotiation, the eastern snow conditions, whether the hold's oldest border map was accurate any longer, and if it needed a new survey. I was not talking about those things. I was talking because her voice was the thing in the room that felt most like warmth, and I did not want to stop hearing it, and I knew if I sat quietly enough in my own chest for long enough, I was going to say something I was not ready to say cleanly. I had stood to go, and she had looked up from where she had been sitting, her hands around her mug, her face in the firelight completely composed and completely present, and I had stood there for a moment too long, and something in the space between us had been full, not with anything said, but with everything acknowledged. We had both known it was there. We had both, by unspoken agreement, let it remain unspoken. "Good night, Alpha," she had said, not cold, not a dismissal, simply the close of an evening. "Good night, Marina," I had said and gone. I had spent the walk back to my chamber understanding that she knew. She had always known. She was not pretending not to see what she was seeing. She was choosing, deliberately and with full information, to wait, to give me the space I needed to find my own way to it. She was not going to reach through the wall, not because she did not want to, but because she understood that a wall reached through is not the same as a wall come down from the inside, and she wanted the latter for both of us, or she wanted nothing. I owed her something for that. I was not sure it was repayable in any reasonable time frame. I intended to try. The formal bond ceremony was 3 weeks later, when the road was clear enough for the tributary pack leaders to ride in, and the hall could be properly prepared. Marina had, characteristically, begun preparing the hall the day after we had decided on the timing, not because it was her role. It was no longer her role in the same way. She had told 2 of the younger wolves who reported to her that morning that they were now taking on the senior keeper duties, which they had received with the expression of wolves who had been waiting to be trusted with more. But because she had been keeping this hall for 3 years, and she knew exactly how it should look for an occasion that mattered, I watched her oversee it from the gallery above the great hall. She moved through the space with the same unhurried, purposeful steadiness she always had, the same quiet direction, the same willingness to do the small, unglamorous tasks herself rather than delegate everything. She looked up once and found me at the gallery rail, and the amber warmth of the bond glowed soft on her wrist. She gave me the slight tilt at the corner of her mouth. I went downstairs. Torvald sent a formal apology via his envoy a week before the ceremony. The apology was in the careful language of pact diplomacy and did not acknowledge what he had actually done, which was try to acquire a person. I accepted it in the same language, because a formal war over what had effectively already been resolved was not a good use of anyone's winter. But I made certain, through the correct channels, that it was understood in the compact territories what the attempt had been and what it would mean, going forward, if a similar attempt were made from any direction about any member of Ironfin's pack. The morning of the ceremony was cold and bright, the kind of northern winter morning that was not gentle but was honest, all clean light and sharp air, and the smell of pine from the wood stacked against the hall's eastern wall. Marina's new formal dress was deep blue, the color of the river in the last light of autumn, and she wore her hair loose, as she had the first evening the pack had gathered to know what we were, and the bond mark on her wrist was warm amber in the cold bright light. She walked into the hall and the pack was assembled and Bren was at the great hearth with his ceremony staff, and she looked at none of them particularly. She looked at me, standing at the hall's center in my formal armor, the Ironfin insignia bright on the breastplate. And then she walked to me the way she moved through her mornings, steady, purposeful, without performance, simply herself doing what she had decided to do. I took her hand. The bond mark flared gold, not wildly, not dramatically, but fully, the same way the hall's fire fills a room when you add the evening's big log, a complete, even warmth that reaches the corners. The pack around us was absolutely still and then entirely not still. The particular sound of wolves who feel something true resonating through a shared space, a sound that is not quite words and not quite silence. Old Bren said what needed to be said. I said what I had prepared to say, which was shorter than traditional because I had never been a man of many ceremony words, but what I said, I meant completely. Marina said what she had prepared to say, which was also short and also precise and also entirely hers. Not the words of a woman who had been managing toward this outcome for 3 years, but the words of a woman who had decided, on a day 3 weeks ago in a council room with morning light coming through the window, that this was what she was choosing, and chose it fully. The hall was warm, the fire was bright. The pack was loud in the way of wolves who are genuinely glad, not performing gladness. And Marina, standing beside me with her hand in mine and the bond mark glowing amber on her wrist, looked out at the people and the fire and the great hall she had kept through 3 long winters, and something in her face, usually so composed and directed, went briefly, privately soft, the way it did at the kitchen window in the late afternoons when she watched the wolves playing in the yard. Only not privately, here for once in the full warm light. I kept her hand. That was 3 years ago now, and the fire has not gone cold. It has not gone cold through the winter when the North Road was blocked for 6 weeks, and we were short on grain, and the hold pulled together in the way holds pull together when they trust each other, and are not afraid. Marina had foreseen the shortage. It was in her autumn account, a careful note about the harvest shortfall in the eastern fields, and a suggested reduction in the feast hall portions through the dark months, starting in the 2nd week of the close season, so that the shortage would be managed before it became a crisis. I had read the note and authorized the adjustment, and by the time the road closed we were better placed than we would otherwise have been, and no one in the hold went hungry. She did not say "I told you so" because she was Marina, and she did not need to say things like that. She made the good thing happen and moved on to the next thing that needed doing. It has not gone cold through the summer when the border dispute flared again, and I was at the war table from morning until past the evening bells, and Marina was running the hold and the kitchen, and two of the southern tributary holds supply arrangements simultaneously, without complaint, with her notebook and her small scale and her absolute unshakable certainty about what needed doing and when. She brought me a meal at the war table 3 nights in a row, not as a service but simply because I had forgotten to eat, and the hold ran better with its alpha functional, which was her practical reasoning, and I accepted it. And on the 4th night I came to the kitchen myself, which she had not asked me to do. And we sat at the table where we had sat once before in the gray pre-dawn, and talked about the border situation and the supply routes and the 2 tributary packs whose positions I needed to understand better. And she knew things about both of them, the keeper's arrangements, the domestic history, the small practical grievances that diplomatic channels never quite captured, that proved, in the following weeks, genuinely useful. She had been keeping notes for 3 years. The notes were thorough. The notes were kept in the same small notebook she used for the hold's provisions, in the same clear hand, with the same dry precision. She was not a military strategist. She was something else that, I had by then decided, was equally necessary. A person who paid attention to the human texture of a situation, who noticed what people needed and what they feared and what they were quietly ashamed of, and who filed it all away in her careful notebooks against the day when it might matter. It has not gone cold through the small daily things that a life is made of, the gray mornings and the long evenings and the ordinary conversations, and the meals in the hall with the pack, which I no longer skip, because Marina sits there at the table, and I sit beside her, and the pack is loud and easy and alive. Marina did not watch the king. She kept his fire and tended his wolves, and rose before dawn to write in her notebook what needed doing and what had not been done. And she did not perform for anyone, and she did not manage anyone, and she did not ask for anything, and she simply was herself, steadily, consistently, without audience, until the king had been watching her for nearly 3 years, and discovered that watching was no longer enough. That, I think, is how the truest things happen. Not with a ceremony or a mark burn at first sight, though those are real, and they are beautiful, and the bond is not diminished for having taken the road it took, but with a fire in an old stone hearth, burning through a northern winter, with a small woman who does not watch the powerful man and does not try to fix the wall he has built, but simply keeps the hall warm until he is ready to come in from the cold. Ash died in the 4th winter in her sleep in the warm passage outside the kitchen door. Marina was with her. She did not tell me until morning. When she told me, her voice was even and her eyes were clear, and she said that Ash had been comfortable and had not been alone. Then she said there was a young female in the outer yard who had been without a named attachment since her pack bond dispersed, and that she thought the wolf needed a proper keeper relationship before the winter deepened. I said, then give her one. Marina gave me the slight tilt at the corner of her mouth. Then she went to the east yard, and within the week the young female had taken up residence in the warm passage outside the kitchen door. The fire has not gone cold. I do not think it will.